time, depending on where you're calling in from. As you notice, we started recording. This is to allow people who can't join us right now to catch up with the content of today's session. This is the 7th, can you believe it, peer learning session that we run on Indigo. As usual, we bring together data enthusiasts on how data can be used, shared, improved to support those who want to achieve better social outcomes. As always, we have a quite packed agenda. We want to discuss substance. So I suggest everybody to say who you are, where you're calling from, and something about you, like your organization or what is your interest in the chat. And we get going because, as I said, this session is only 1 hour and we have 2 formidable speakers. We are talking about a subject which is the use of smart use of existing data and to collect information on social outcomes. And I'm sure we will have a lot of questions and a lovely discussion. So I suggest we jump right in. Do we have an agenda for today, Juliana? You have the slide, you are in charge.
Yes, so we're going to start sharing some Indigo updates, and then we're going to leave the floor to Richard and Tom, who will be speaking about the different uses of technology to measure social outcomes under the framework of outcome-based contracts. So first of all, welcome. We are delighted to have you all here again in our peer learning session. Next slide, please. I'm going to share with you some Indigo updates, especially the ones that I think will be you will find more insightful or useful for your work. So first of all, I want to tell you that we published the 2nd edition of our Indigo Impact Bonds Insights report. What we try to do with this report is to take stock of our latest data in our impact bond data set and write a description of the state of the arts in the impact bond, let's say the impact bond world. This report is only as good as our data. This is why I really want to say thank you to all the organizations that share data with us in the last month. I also want to invite you to keep sharing data with us in the future. If you want to access the report, you can scan our QR code. Next slide, please. And also I want to ask you to keep an eye on our Indigo page, because we will be asking for feedback on our data definitions in the next days. This time we want to have good definitions of the roles that different organizations can play in an impact bond project. So we want to have a good and robust definition of what's a service provider, what's an outcome funder, what's a commissioner. So if you feel strongly about that and you have ideas, please get in touch with us, because we'll be working on that in the next month. And next slide, please. And we are also delighted that we are preparing another Hack and Learn event. Next slide. This time we have really exciting challenges. So together with INSPIRE, we are going to run challenges about outcome metrics and SDGs, and some other challenges about social value and outcomes frameworks across different countries. Our friends from Ashoka are going to be leading challenges about foreign philanthropy in India, and a different one about understanding talent in the not-for-profit sector. And together with Village Enterprise and the Education Outcomes Fund, we're going to be having a different set of challenges. And these organizations are going to be sharing with us data and their real world challenges so we can address them all together. So we have 6 very exciting challenges to propose, and we invite you all to be a part of this and come work with us in these 2 weeks of Hack and Learn. I have one more update to share with you, which is about our Social Outcomes Conference. We are inviting submissions for papers and presentations from policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. The deadline is the 4th of April, but we are accepting academic papers. If you are a practitioner and you want to bring a more practitioner-focused presentation, we're also welcoming those type of presentations. And you can also propose a new panel if you feel that you have a special topic that you want to discuss and has not been discussed previously. I think this is the place and the moment to have that discussion. Again, you can scan the QR code here, or you can look at the different links that Mayra will be dropping in the chat if you want to access more information about our conference or any other of our Indigo updates. And having said that, it's back to you, Mara, because we have 2 great speakers and I want to leave all the time for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Richard Maticania. Richard is the director and chief operating officer of Triggerize. If you don't know Triggerize, Richard will tell something about it, but I noted their motto, their vision, which is to connect smart insights and proactive tech, full stop, for good, full stop. So this is a great ambition. Richard is responsible for the Triggerize platform, and in particular, he leads on projects and that cover the African countries. His background is global health, management, monitoring, and evaluation. And today we've asked him to talk us about the TICO platform and how this platform can use real-time data to measure social outcomes. To both speakers, I asked the same question. I asked them to tell us what type of technology they are using in the context of development impact bonds in particular, to discuss a little bit the benefits and the risks of using this tech in the measurement of social outcome, and a perspective for the future. What do they see coming in terms of the use of tech in the measurement of social outcomes? So the floor is yours, Richard. Please keep your question coming in the chat. And Richard has 10 minutes presentation, and after his presentation, we can ask him some question before going to the second speaker.
Great, thank you very much, Mara, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I've looked at the chats and I see a lot of people that I know, some of them who we are currently collaborating with also on some new initiatives. So great to see you all here. And maybe we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to start off, for those that don't know us, just by a very quick introduction of who we are. Triggerize is essentially a spin-off of a large US-based nonprofit, Population Services International. So we're established in 2014, and essentially what we do is we harness the power of technology and behavioral insights to actually motivate users to adapt positive behaviors, whether they may be in the health space, the well-being space, the economic empowerment space, and connect users to these services and products through our platform that we call TICO. And what TICO actually does, it's based on interactions. So if you're a user, you enroll onto our platform, and it's a multi-channel platform. So you can enroll through an app, you can enroll through Facebook, through WhatsApp, through Instagram, through Twitter, through Telegram. And basically, once you've enrolled onto our platform, you then have access to a menu of services that you can actually take up and utilize. And these services are actually delivered by our partners. And basically what our TICO platform then does is validate those transactions and the impact of the transactions that you actually make. So if you go to a clinic and you take up, for instance, a health service, or you go for an HIV test, or you go for a pregnancy test, our platform, because it's based on live interactions between two people, then validates those particular transactions. And we then take advantage of that data. One, obviously, I'll talk a bit later around the work that we're doing in terms of impact and outcome verification. But two, also, we then use behavioral insights to then power our iterative programming. Next slide, please. So essentially what we're able to do with our process is around three things. So firstly, because of the nature of the platform and the data that we generate, we have access to real-time data. So in terms of monitoring the performance of implementation, and in this particular case, the performance of any sort of outcome-based contract, whether it's an RBF mechanism, whether it's an impact bond, whether it's a development impact bond, our platform really provides that power and allows us to be able to do that very quickly in real time. And because performance is always subject to change, there's always contextual issues that affect change, there's always changes in behaviors because we are working with human beings, the platform data is really a powerful tool for us and helps drive a very iterative, insight-driven process where we are constantly able to adjust based on the data we receive what sort of motivation we need to provide to our users, what sort of motivation we need to provide to any of our other actors to ensure that we're able to achieve our outcomes. And finally, it's really based on partnerships, because we're unable to actually deliver this particular interventions that we have without partners. And we talked about connecting. And really, our platform is very much like an Amazon marketplace, if you're thinking about it, because what we do is we're connecting a range of suppliers of services and products that then users can take up and use. So partnerships are then an important part of the work that we do as part of our INDIGO platform. So I just wanted to go into the next slide and just really take you through some of the difficult, our current experience actually in terms of outcome-based contracting. So we've just concluded implementing the world's first adolescent SRH development impact bond. It was 6.4 million, it was 18 months, really at the height of COVID in terms of implementation. And I'll talk a bit more about that later in terms of challenges when we start talking about technology and authentication. And Children's Investment Fund was our impact investor. The British government was the outcome payer. And there were a number of metrics that we were, payment metrics that are linked, that our platform actually monitors, that we were actually monitoring on our platform. This bond ended a few days ago, but we're transitioning now to a new bond with a new partnership. And that will be an approximately $20 million bond. We're working with the United Nations SDG Fund. They are providing outcome payer resources. And we're currently in the process now of finalizing multiple investors to take on and support this bid. So it's going to start again in September, and it's going to be longer this time, more money, and 5 years. And then also we are transitioning, this was focused primarily on SRH. This new bond is now going to add HIV and HIV matrix onto the platform. So just that question that you asked, the first question that you've asked, Mara, next slide, around, what have been some of the difficulty, what technologies are we actually applying? So firstly, as I said, our platform is a mobile phone-based technology platform that actually validates interactions. And as I said earlier, users can actually access and utilize our platform through multiple channels. So through an app itself, an Android-based app, or an Apple-based app, SMS, Facebook, WhatsApp, voice, and Telegram. So that's the first part of the stack. The second part of it is biometrics. And biometrics are really interesting because they really are able to authenticate that the person on the other side of that particular interaction is real and is a real person. And essentially, so we use two stacks. We started off with face, and I'll talk a bit later about our transition to voice with COVID. We added voice to that stack to begin to authenticate users and service providers in terms of the services that they take up. It's then supported through real-time data visualization, and we use Tableau, and that provides us the visualization that we need to be able to set up the program. And because our program, in this particular case, subsidizes service uptake in the private sector for adolescents and young people, our stack includes an electronic voucher management system that's able to issue out vouchers and authenticate those vouchers. And then and because we are also using vouchers, our stack also includes two things. One, a fraud engine, which enables us to potentially manage any electronic voucher management related fraud. And then an AI-based nudge engine, which allows us to actually undertake A/B experimentation in terms of testing out very quickly nudges that we want to use to improve performance. So that's essentially the stack that we've been applying to date. And all of this is then visualized in Tableau. And essentially, because we're using technology, the interesting thing about our program is that actually our verifiers, unlike traditional external verification, their verification is actually focused on looking at the authenticity of the transactions on our platform, rather than some outside survey, for instance, to be able to actually verify that a transaction has taken place. So next slide, what have been the challenges? What have been some of the difficulties? Well, the first one really for us is regulation. And I think that's an important one because essentially, particularly when you're working with young people, the regulation can be quite contradictory. So for instance, in Kenya, and this is also very true in a lot of the other countries that we work in, young people can access services without parental consent in terms of the health legislation. But when you look at data protection regimes, and a lot of them now are built on the back of GDPR, those regimes now say, guess what? For those under the age of 16, actually parental consent is actually required for them to interact with the platform. So in terms of actually receiving a service, that's a nice, easy thing. They can do that. But now, because they're interacting with a technology platform, and this is going to be the case everywhere, then the regulatory regime around data protection and privacy comes into account. So that's one challenge. And for us, how we managed to face that was to get exemptions from the government, from the regulator in country to allow us to be able to work with young people to do that, to enable them to actually use our platform. Secondly, because of technology, technology relies on connectivity. So connectivity is always a particular issue because one, and I don't know if a lot of you have already seen that in terms of the news, depending on the government, depending on the political situation, mobile data can be shut down, mobile spaces can be closed. So again, while you're implementing an outcome-based contract, these are really key issues that you need to potentially think about. Then there's an issue of change management. The use of technology for outcome verification and measurement entails a transition from a lot of paper-based. What was paper-based verification? I can come in and look at a register, I can look at a form, I can look at an attendance sheet, and now it's all technology-based. So there's been a lot of change management that's required to transition a lot of actors around supporting the use of technology. A very clear advantage that we've seen for us is really around verification costs, especially when you're doing outcome-based contracts. The transactional costs around managing verification tend to be very, very high. And the use of technology has really allowed us to reduce those verification costs quite significantly. So they tend to vary between 5 to 10%. In our particular bond, those verification costs are under 3%. And in our new bond that we're going to, we're looking at 1.5% in terms of verification costs of those outcomes and data. So that's also an advantage. And then finally for us, it's really about the agility that the technology provides in terms of real-time data, which allows us to rapidly adjust. Instead of potentially looking at undertaking a survey at the end of a particular period, a quarter, our platform provides real-time data, and we're able to use that real-time data immediately to make the necessary adjustments to ensure that we can then increase performance. And then finally, something I hadn't put down here, but obviously, over the past 2.5 years, COVID has been in the picture. And what has that meant in terms of how we use and utilize technology, particularly around authentication? So when we developed our technology initially, our authentication was face. It was face authentication. So now, obviously, masks come in. In terms of the masks mandate, what has that meant? And basically the technology then becomes difficult to utilize and change. So we had to be agile again. And what we then did was transition to voice. And voice took into account the challenges around COVID, and we're able to then continue to authenticate the services and the matrices that we're receiving funding for. So in a nutshell, those are the difficulties and challenges. So I know you'd also asked me, Mara, to talk a bit about the future, what the future looks like. And Tom and I had a conversation a few days ago, and I decided to leave it a bit because I think Tom's presentation is going to really encapsulate about what we think in terms of the future is with technology. So maybe I can potentially just leave it to Tom to respond and add, and then I can complement Tom's presentation.
Thank you, Richard. This is a fascinating advancement, and I am particularly grateful for you to share the impact on verification costs. This is something really concrete and is high on the agenda of those looking at impact bonds, development impact bonds. Is it worth? How do I collect information? So this could be really be revolutionary. So I'm opening up to questions. You can post a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand in the reaction that you find at the bottom. And maybe can we stop sharing the slides so we can see everybody's face? Well, everybody's name. If you can, please leave your camera on. So it's just nice to see who is in the room. So I have Elle. I also have a question, but do you want to go first, Elle?
Thanks so much, Richard. That was really fascinating. I work as a researcher, and I've done a lot of work around employment outcomes contracting in the past, and there's been real evolution in how data is captured around employment outcomes. So it's really interesting to see some more of the real-time information that you're using in a very different setting. My question is around quality of interactions and the perceived quality of that service that young people are accessing. So I was just wondering whether you had any reflections on how to integrate some of that participant experience in the data collection that you're describing. Thank you.
Do I respond immediately? Then maybe I can just respond. Thanks all for your question, Ellen. And you'll be interesting to know that in Ethiopia, we're actually working on an RBF mechanism that's actually focused on employment outcomes. So we've just begun that work. We were in the design phase of that RBF. We are contracting with effect from next month. And that's going to be 3 years, and it's going to focus on employment outcomes for young people. And we're using our platform to do the exact same thing in terms of measurement of outcomes. To your question though, and that's the power of our platform. Participant feedback is an important part of our platform. And essentially what happens is our participant feedback is already built into the platform. So the minute that a young person takes up a service, and whatever that service is, we have already built in, firstly, a ratings tool. So basically the minute a young person takes up, for instance, an HIV test or a self-HIV test at a pharmacy or clinic, for instance, as soon as that service is done, they are immediately asked in 3 minutes after they've taken up that service, what did they think about the provider? Just generally, were they certified with the service that he provided them? 2, what did they think of the quality of the interaction with the provider? And quality here is what we, based on user-designed processes with young people, they told us, for me, a quality HIV testing session, for instance, is one where I'm told about how to use the test, one where I'm told about how to interpret the test results, one way I'm told about what to do in terms of where to go if I have an HIV positive test. So basically what we've then done is, based on that, we created all of these rating questions. And immediately upon that validation of that interaction, those rating questions then kick in. And we chose 3 minutes because, one, we didn't want a young person to be influenced at the point of interaction by a provider. And young people told us also that, guess what, between 3 and 5 minutes, after that, it's very hard for me to give you my feedback, but three minutes is still very much present in terms of the services that I've received. And all of these ratings are specific to the type of service that young people receive. So participant feedback is a critical part of our program. And we cover it both for users with technology and for users who also don't have technology. So basically, those with a particular card, we've created a mechanism where they can use a barcode on that card and then also input their experience with the services that they've received, using other service providers who are compensated to exactly do that.
Thank you, Richard. You started answering my question in terms of access for people who don't have a mobile phone. So I go to my second question. I have another question, which is, I'm curious to know if there is any change you made on the platform from like the one that you're using now to the one that you're using for the larger program. Have you learned something? Are things that you wanted to change? people embarking in a similar exercise? Do you have like a absolute do's and absolute don'ts that you carry with you?
Yeah, sure. I think for us, there's an important learning. I think the first one is really that first challenge that I talked about around change management. And it's especially if you're working in low-income areas where traditionally paper has been the form of verification. So there's a bit of change management that needs to be done for people to have comfort with technology, understand its use. And I think a lot of time needs to be spent on actually taking people through the system itself so they can understand it and then trust it. And once that trust is there, then the process becomes easier. The second one, also very much linked to change management process, is getting people to work with technology. And for us, the key principle has been the simpler the technology and the interface, the easier it is for people to actually take it on, adapt it, and use it. And that's an important lesson as you think through and you're designing technology-based outcome verification mechanisms as well.
Thank you. Is there any immediate question following up for Richard before we, yeah, Juliana?
This is not so much of a question, but I just wanted to say that what Richard said really resonated with me, because some years ago when I was a civil servant, I was working in a very similar project that what was trying to do was to convert how the national administration was working, and we were trying to start using a website. It was not a website, it was an electronic system, and we were trying to leave the paper aside. And something that looked really exciting and attractive, and something that someone would say, yeah, we should totally start doing this. It was really difficult to do it, because it was really difficult to go from a paper-based system to an electronic system. That's something that is really difficult to do. It's really difficult to convince people to start working on electronic systems. And it's really difficult to create trust on electronic systems. So I think that you have lots of lessons and learnings to share about how do you create trust in a mobile application, on a website, on any other type of electronic system. And I think there's something really good to learn there, not just for outcome-based contracts, but for any person who's trying to change systems and to manage change across an organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We might come back to you in the discussion at the end, picking up points with Tom as well. But I'd like to move us along and give space to Tom Rintoul. Tom is an associate director at the Social Finance Digital and Data team. He really brings a practitioner perspective because he spent a lot of time doing design and delivery of outcome-based contracts, in particular in welfare to work. So he will bring this perspective of how does it feel to interact with the technology on the ground. At the moment, he is really focused on how we can use data effectively, and is engaged in a number of projects, quite innovative, scoping the way in which impact bond, and in particular development impact bond, can benefit from the use of these technologies. So with no further ado, the floor is yours, Tom, and let's see what is coming.
Hello, thanks, Mara. And yeah, I think thanks for having me here, and for pairing me up with Richard, because I think it's a really nice combination. I think you have the specific and the general. You know, Richard and the team at Triggerize, like the best example I know of people really investing in using technology to improve outcomes monitoring in real delivery on the ground. And then, you know, as Richard mentioned, I suppose I've been looking more at, well, where else could that be useful, and why is it not happening elsewhere, and what might help it catch on? So I will speak a little to that now. So give me a moment. There we go. Can you see sort of a nice picture of happy people and post-its? Marvelous. Okay. So yeah, so we're sort of looking at the, I suppose, the context, right? You know, if what Richard and co are doing is great, and I think it is, well, why? How much of it is happening elsewhere, and what might make that go faster? And been helped a lot in that by some people here. So I noticed Charlie and Radana and some people from Brink and IMC are in the room, and you know they've been sort of leading some of the way on funding work on this, and Cordaid and the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands as well. So, I mean, brief background, I think, is it reasonable to assume that everybody in the room understands social outcomes contracts and DIBs? I'd say sort of broadly, we're talking about using technology and outcomes monitoring in outcomes contracts. Let's say, you know, if a traditional contract says, I want to install 10 million bed nets because that will reduce malaria, and I think that's going to cost £100 million. Please, can I have it? An outcomes contract says, well, okay, I'm going to install 10 million bed nets. Will you give me £10 for each one? And so you essentially transfer, in theory, I suppose, both the performance risk and the responsibility to cash flow this to the organization doing the work, or to sort of an investor who might be involved with them. But when you, and that's caught on, as many people here have been involved in making happen, but one of the challenges that it presents on the ground, and as Mara said, that's where I started, is you suddenly say, well, I used to run this organization where we just did stuff. And there was a whole team of people whose job it was to get money in, and, you know, they dealt with the funders, and the funders wanted to know how the program worked. But now, because we're being paid for outcomes, there is so much attention on, did that outcome really happen or not? And can you prove it? And on being able to forecast the outcomes that will happen in the future. And we just don't have the habits and the processes and the technical systems to collect that. And that change, just like Juliana mentioned, so the switch over from paper, that change is really hard. And I think that's what makes the sort of the potentially sort of the role of sort of digital technology in this quite interesting. So flicking through, I thought it'd be worth talking a little bit about where do we think there might actually be some value to be created for better use of sort of technology. It's not an end in itself. And then what are the things we're still trying to work out? And amongst those, what do we know already? And I think, conscious that there's a lot of researchers in the room, that I think most of this is still things we'd like to work out. So really interested if anybody wants to get in touch and think about how we might do more of that together. So I mean, the first area that we see, and I think Richard touched on this, where you might get some value, is making what we already do easier. So in fact, I think one of the people who said this is in the room, but basically, you know, we did some research last year, really sort of going around speaking to a lot of the people involved in funding and designing and delivering outcomes-based contracts, asking them a series of questions about, I suppose, yes, sort of how they felt about the data that they got and about how they contract for outcomes, the relationship between the two. A couple of things that jump out. People saying basically they want a broader scope of data, they want it to be more granular, they want to get it faster, and they want to have greater confidence in it. You know, that's not anybody saying, I want everything to be totally different. They're saying, I want to do the same things I do now, but I want the data that would help me manage those things better. And the same on the other side. So somebody, several people actually in a recent exercise talking about how they're running outcomes contracts. Eleanor mentioned employment contracts. One of the people in my mind was running an employment contract in South America. Said, look, number one, we deliver loads of outcomes and we can't get paid for them because we can't verify them. I'm supposed to send a guy on a motorbike to meet the person who got a job and to persuade them to sign a thing and to persuade their employer to sign a thing. And that's just too much work. And sometimes it doesn't happen. Also saying, actually, I think in one of those cases, when we submit outcomes, because there's a financial dimension to this now, I'm basically, you know, if I'm wrong about my outcomes claim, then, you know, we're talking about fraud rather than just a mistake. You know, I have Deloitte sitting on top of me, checking everyone, see if they're correct, and my funders won't pay until Deloitte says it's done. And Deloitte takes so long to do this thing that actually in that time, bearing in mind what's going on in inflation, my outcomes have lost 50% of their value. I mean, that one really stuck with me. So, you know, a lot of people really just interested in reducing friction in the system. Some classic examples of sort of where technology is useful in there, and so Richard's talked to a few of those. And I think I think about this by reference back to, I think it was actually a GoLab training in 2019. I think Robert Pollock was here talking about, you know, what are the steps to designing a good outcomes contract? And at least, I think there were 4, and of the ones I can remember, you know, definitely in there was design, you know, who are my beneficiaries? And so, you know, a key thing, a lot of what Richard's worked on is, well, validate the beneficiary ID. You know, this person that's walked into your training session, who are they? And is that person eligible for this intervention? Is that person eligible for, is any outcome relating to that person eligible for intervention? And so, you know, Richard's already talked about sort of the things they're doing around biometrics, and, you know, I won't dwell on that. Another classic one you often see relating back to the design of outcomes contracts, validating that a service was delivered. Now, when you control the setting, that's quite straightforward. I think there's some good examples from education where people are saying, well, okay, we get paid in part for making sure that people attend this series of 8 training sessions and then that they pass an exam. Well, okay, I have little tablets where they tick that they attend the training, and I know where that tablet was, and it recognizes somebody's face, and then we can do the same thing around an exam. Pretty straightforward. A lot, though, involve validating that a service was actually accessed in a setting you don't control. So, and I think Neveline's here might be able to talk a little bit about this. So if your training was partly to encourage people to go and use antenatal classes while they were pregnant, a lot of the time your outcomes contract might involve paying you when that happens. Well, how do I know whether or not somebody actually went to an appointment with a nurse who I have no contractual or personal relationship with? That's a tricky problem. But increasingly we see sort of examples of people using technology. An example I saw was basically sort of a one-time passcodes. Basically, sort of a little device sits on a clinician's desk, flashes up both. Here is a number to text, it's free, and here is a constantly changing number that you text to this phone number. And when that happens, the machine at the other end says, I know this phone, that's Richard's phone. I recognize this number because my system is generating those numbers. And that tells me that Richard, with his phone, is now sitting in the office of Dr. Mara and is, therefore I agree that this service was delivered. Validating that a product was bought. So, again, some outcomes contracts, if you sort of stick with some of those sexual health examples, might be about saying, we want to see that people go on to use condoms. Well, how do you know that they were bought? The TECO system that Richard's described, sort of solves some of those problems, and you can talk more to that. Validating that a product was delivered and being used. I like this because I think, let's not think about technology, let's think about outcomes contracts. An outcomes contract will typically have a theory of change. And a theory of change will say something like, and if I think of cook stoves, today's cook stoves push an enormous amount of pollution into the home that causes respiratory illness. This new cook stove is much more efficient, doesn't produce all those particles in the air. If people use these cook stoves, here will be the positive impact on their health, which is great. But if the only thing you can measure is that cook stoves were created and that marketing was done and that some got sold, you have no idea whether people actually use them or not. Never mind whether or not there's any positive impact on their health. So one good example, and some material in there, I think Nextleaf published quite a lot about this. We're saying, well, okay, well, maybe we can actually sort of integrate into a sample of our cook stoves, sensors which detect when they're being used, and basically a tiny mobile phone that then broadcasts the information about that back to a monitoring point. So you can sometimes see where the service was used. That thing's really interesting. And then finally, coming back to the point that Eleanor made earlier about employment programs, although not exclusively for employment programs, a lot of what we talked about here, these use cases are around, was a service delivered, was a product bought, was a product used, outcomes, not impact. Built into that theory of change, built into the business case for doing this thing in the first place, will be some theory about how, if these services are used, if these products are used, what is the good thing that happens in someone's life? Definitely, I wouldn't say this is about technology in terms of sort of boxes and wires or sort of creating new software applications, but really just about sort of connecting up data at the back end. And so, classic examples would be, here in the UK, actually, the work that's been done to make it possible when I'm a beneficiary of a welfare to work program, rather than those guys on the motorbikes having to go around collecting my signature, which they did when I started my career, now you can actually sort of query against HMRC data, and it will say not just, is Tom paying national insurance, but you can actually then start to use that more for evaluation, and you can look ahead and say, well, okay, not just did Tom get a job or not, but 3-4 years later, what kind of sort of trajectory up through sort of working hours, well, not necessarily working hours, but certainly income has Tom experienced, and how does that compare to other people like him? So those, I think, are some of the classic use cases, and I think that's really important to talk about, not just the technology itself, but what are the ways in which it allows us to do a better job of designing and running outcomes contracts. And we sort of talked a little bit about cook stoves, not just reducing friction, but also allowing us to measure entirely new things. I'm really pleased that somebody mentioned beneficiary voice a moment ago. I think arguably we hear that we're talking more about new services rather than new technologies, but certainly the new technology is making it easier to provide those services cheaply. So, interesting example of an organization which basically takes care of beneficiary voice for you using sort of technologies in a workforce that you might not be able to put together yourself. And then something we'll maybe come back to in the Q&A, because I know there's some interest in sort of the big future looking things, but most of what we talked about so far, I suppose, has been, so see, Mara, I can see you like this one. I normally use the underpants notes here, but I thought that might be a little bit flippant, but I didn't know who was going to be in the audience. But you know, if a lot of what we talked about so far is really, really quite operational, right? How do I do the same things I do today, but a bit better? There are also people looking at, well, okay, if you were to move to a world where there were lots of outcomes robustly validated using digital means, what new ways might that make possible of funding international development, and how might that change the economy of aid? But something to come back to later. And so briefly, I suppose, you know, in terms of sort of, you know, what do we know, what would we like to know? You know, as I said at the very start, you know, sort of Richard and his team are sort of maybe the best examples of people who are sort of doing this. I'm thinking about how do we help more people to do what Richard's doing. I'd say from the work we've done so far, and sort of, you know, recently with Radana and Charlie was a good example, looking at sort of 6 different DIB teams and sort of the kind of challenges they had and so what kind of technologies might help. I would say basic hypothesis, we can add value in DIBs using existing technology. We don't need to create new things. I'd say this is about configuring existing technologies and integrating them into services. In most places, the bulk of the work is going to be, how do you redesign your service, and in some cases your business model, around the opportunity that creates. I think I've said a few times, you know, that it's important not to overestimate the technical capability of the organizations currently developing the DIBs. When I first met Richard, I think he was actually the 6th of 6 organizations we interviewed, and 5 out of 6 were running DIBs, you know, very smart people, very successful in what they built up. And these teams more or less said, one after another, we have this problem. Can you tell us what kind of technology would be useful to solve it? These were not teams which had a lot of experience of using technology in their own programs. They were looking for somebody else to bring that. Triggerize were really unusual, because I think, if I remember rightly, we were first introduced, here's our chief technology officer, and, you know, in the next meeting they said, you know, there are 15 developers working with him. Really, really unusual, and that's not the norm in either in the investors or in the organizations delivering contracts. So the barriers to adoption are probably around incentives, the capacity to make use of that kind of technology, and the cost of change, you know, as was mentioned earlier with the shift over from paper. And those, I think, are sort of pretty classic management problems rather than technology problems. And you're probably looking at fairly classic sort of management solutions, but maybe that's something to talk about more afterwards. So I will stop there to be interested in what other people think about this.
Thank you, Tom. Fascinating. As always, raise your hand or place a question in the chat, or a wave if I can see you in the screen. I might kick us off with like, one of the things that puzzles me, like, that I always wonder if this is a barrier, I don't know if you encounter it on the ground, is there is a sense of distrust by collecting personal information and putting it on a server somewhere, when it's not clear who owns it, how it can be linked up with other data. So you can access information from my mobile phone. There are so much information about me on my mobile phone. What are my habits? Do you encounter this resistance as a part of the user, or working with young people, this is not a barrier?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, you know, Richard, you might have sort of more sort of direct experience of that, maybe a more interesting answer.
Yeah, I think it's an important consideration, Mara. And for us, what we've also therefore done is we negotiate, because all of our interventions are built on privacy by design. What we always focus on is data minimization. And for us, what is the absolute minimum amount of data that we need to collect to be able to verify a particular output or outcome. So that's what we tend to focus on. So for instance, in Kenya, we're only collecting data on 3 points from a user that we then use to be able to validate the rest of the services. So we collect obviously their phone number, we collect their age and their gender, nothing else. And that creates a lot of comfort again, because we discussed what sort of information are you prepared to provide, prepared to engage with, and that provides that comfort. So upfront, that education around how is my data going to be used, what is it for, that's an important consideration as you implement and use technology.
Thank you, Richard. Okay.
Thanks. This is maybe quite a broad question. Often we have quite a lot of assumptions around programs as they evolve into an outcomes contract. And I'm just curious as to whether there have been any assumptions that you've either had to uncover or unpack in introducing some of these technologies, and how you've navigated that with funders of outcomes. I mean, I'm thinking about things in terms of who are the beneficiaries, or who ought the intended beneficiaries of the service be, and whether you've had to be quite creative in approaching some of that.
I think for us, and I think just because generally in terms of the way that DIBs are done and because of the importance of verification, a lot of that definition is part of the design work. Who are they? Where are they? What age are they? What social demographic profile do they particularly fit? How much do they earn? These are very important considerations, and they're usually done up front, very early on in terms of the design process. And the reason why that they rarely change, again, is around contracting, because they're then locked in terms of verification. So even if along the way, for instance, I may identify with the work I'm doing that actually there's a particular population that has potentially been excluded, for instance, that actually this program should be focusing on. But if they don't meet the demographics that we've contracted with the outcome payer, those are the challenges. And then because negotiating amendments with outcome-based contracts is quite a laborious process, there's a lot of potential legal ramifications. People want to keep the contract clean, so that there's no changes along the way. That creates then difficulties around doing the sort of thing that you've mentioned, Eleanor. That's been our experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there's something really interesting in there, and it came up quite a lot when we were looking more at alternative ways of funding international development outcomes in an environment where you had better digital outcomes monitoring. So something that came up a lot was what one of the funders put, sort of positive externalities. Said, look, we're funding this program. The program is designed to, let's say, to achieve something around employment. Now, in the end, that's not because. He said, you sort of think about I suppose sort of like the chain of causality. He said, by and large, it's not the case that a funder decides they want to do something about employment, they put up a call, and then people respond, creating new programs and institutions who will do the work from scratch. So actually, this sort of the whole world of sort of the organizations sort of delivering these services sort of tends to exist independently of what sort of funding is going on. And people will look and see, oh, okay, my organization is about all kinds of things, but if that's employment, we need money to keep going. We believe in what we're doing. That funding opportunity there might help. And so I said, so very often it was put to me, said, actually, the program that's being funded is being funded for, let's say, it's sort of, it's employment outcomes, because that happened to be what the funder in question had a mandate to do. But the people who are delivering it are either deliberately or sort of accidentally delivering on a number of other kinds of outcomes as well. And that isn't a part of the contract agreed with that funder, because that funder just only really has a mandate to deal with one particular policy area. This is very often, a funder might have, is more classically, a funder might have more of a specific policy lens, whereas a lot of the organizations doing the delivery might be sort of more thinking about the breadth of what's happening in the lives of a sort of a group of people in a specific geography. And so you get these positive externalities. And one of the things they were interested in was saying, well, look, if I happen to be, through the work that I'm doing on employment, somehow sort of reducing the instance of TB in a particular area, maybe I'm sort of piggybacking sort of services around TB on the back of my employment interventions just because I can and because I'm trying to do useful things in this area. In a space where we are getting better at monitoring those outcomes, can I then find a way to make those outcomes available to other funders who are interested in paying for them? If you move sort of to more of a sort of a marketplace for individual outcomes rather than a world of sort of contracting for programs. I think that's a way off, but it was something I'd not expected when we started thinking about sort of outcomes marketplaces. This idea that actually we're constantly creating loads of positive externalities on the ground and nobody pays for them was like a really interesting angle that popped up.
Thank you, Tom. There is a question in the chat. To go back to the point that you're raising on the political economy of aid. And the question is, what changes do you expect to see in the bigger picture if we achieve a better and more efficient measurements of outcome?
Sure. So I guess, in the so I have to think about it. So when
it's a small question.
Yeah, no, it's a small. I was thinking about sort of.
Do you want me to have a bash at Tom as you
can have a go, Richard. Go.
Okay. I think for us, I think basically, I think what we're seeing, obviously, when you look at donors, they're interested, one, value for money. Value for money is an important part of their work. And what value for money then means is essentially what economy, effectiveness, efficiency. And, the other E now that people talk about is equity. But when you are value for money based and you therefore are potentially just paying for outcomes, that makes a lot of sense to funders and donors. The challenge is the transactional costs of actually developing these mechanisms. That, I think, is the killer, and that's what tends to leave a lot of donors who may potentially be interested in the outcome-based funding to then say, guess what? I need to design it. I will need some expertise. I need to spend some time on it. I need to monitor it. I need to verify. So technology can cut some of this stuff, particularly around the verification costs. But there's these other transactional costs that a donor needs to think about. And as we increasingly see, particularly with a number of the large social impact, development impact donors, they are very thin on the ground in terms of expertise. So they don't have a lot of resources to actually put in terms of design. And that's why they've increasingly gone towards grants. But increasingly, as we develop the evidence of the effectiveness of bonds, I expect to be a change there to then for that transition to start happening in terms of that political economy, where outcome-based contracts just becomes de jour, a standard way of actually doing things. But there's still this whole business around transactional costs that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Richard. I agree with you on this final point that if there are these high costs and the results that you get are the same as a grant, we might as well stay with a grant. So until we are able to show that there are additional costs, but there are additional benefits too, it's quite challenging. Tom.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the immediate benefits, as Richard was saying, are about sort of in a couple of areas. I think sort of one is clearly about sort of reducing transaction costs. In running an outcomes contract because they are high. Similarly about enabling more adaptive management. I mean, that's certainly something that I've always seen. It's something you sort of see in sort of the evaluation of sort of the first generation of social impact bonds in the UK. People saying essentially, well, we started doing this for the money, right? Because it was 2010 and there wasn't a lot of it anywhere else. But actually, we're now like 5 years in, and one of the biggest impacts has been having these like sort of weird private equity people sitting on our boards and like demanding, sort of data about how things are working and why things are working like this, and how might we prioritize what to improve next. And so it's not so much, and so the intense sort of focus on sort of data and the use of data in decision making turned out to be for a lot of people quite valuable sort of change to business practice. And so I think, you've got reducing the outcome cost, you've got reducing the transaction costs. There is something about, I think, enabling more adaptive management. I think there's something interesting about enabling new types of outcomes contracts. particularly when you can move the point of measurement from outputs like people turned up to my training towards impact, and that example with cook stoves I think is an interesting one. By the way, which I believe some of the early evidence showed that actually people weren't really using the cook stoves in the way everybody thought. They were sort of getting bought, used once or twice and left in a corner. And, without, sort of that monitoring of usage that the technology enabled, there were the theory about how you leapt from an outcome to an impact would have been invalid. And, getting that data quickly, coming back to the adaptive learning point, allowed them to change the way that they ran their service in order to sort of drive up usage. But the last piece I think is probably more fundamental. I mean, as a parallel, if you think about the emergence of the railways, right? So if I was running like a textile mill and I made whatever, like trousers on the edge of Manchester, I probably ran it somewhere that was like near a port because that's where I got I had to sort of receive the inputs and was hopefully fairly close to sort of my customers, and and the need to be close to the customers probably limited the size of it, and the emergence of railways doesn't really do a lot for me. Like maybe it knocks a few % off what it costs me to take things to market. That you don't get the meaningful change in my cost of production until I realize, well, hang on a minute, I no longer need to be just on the edge of Manchester because Manchester was my customer base. I can stick one massive factory with enormous economies of scale right in the middle of the country, and the railways will take it everywhere. And it's not until I'm prepared to rebuild how my business functions and its business model that I actually get to sort of capture the benefit of that new technology. And I think there are possibly sort of some similar effects around sort of the hints about political economy around outcomes monitoring, but further off.
Thank you, Tom. We're almost at time, so I have to interrupt you here. There is a very interesting question in the chat about what is the call to action, but I'll pass the word to El or Juliana to do the closing, while maybe you, Tom, and Richard can try to pick up this question. So what can we do now to try to ameliorate some of the challenges that you identified? You made a case, great benefit, there are some challenges. What is the call to action? And while you're busy answering this question, I leave to El or Juliana to make an announcement, and I thank everybody for participating.
Thank you. I mean, that's an interesting question that's been asked. And I guess for me, there's two aspects to it. The first one, I think, is some evangelization that we need to do. And I think that's an important part of the work in terms of making sure we advocate in terms of the clear benefits that technology provides. So that's one. And then two, address through advocacy the discomforts that people have with technology, particularly around privacy, in terms of its use to measure and monitor outcomes. So I think that's the first one for me. And that would be the first one. Since you asked for one, you gave me a nice, easy out. Tom.
Yeah, I would say, if we want to, going back to the idea that there's a lot of value to be added with relatively simple technology that already exists. I mean, for me, the big call to action would be, let's focus on breadth, not depth. We take people, like Triggerize, who are already, sort of 7 years into this journey, doing something well, and say, how do we make that work for everybody else? And for me, that's probably a combination of productize what they have so it's easier for other people to adopt. Probably need to sort of create or sort of help existing intermediary organizations to take this up and offer it in, so that you don't have to have a CTO and 15 developers to make use of it. You can actually have sort of somebody turn up during the div design process and work it in. And there's probably something around subsidizing some of those early adopters as it first comes out of Triggerize and into other organizations. I know there's people in the room already working on that, so that we can actually sort of, partly sort of evangelize, as Richard said, let's, if this works well in other places, let's, produce those stories, but also because it probably won't work incredibly well the first couple of times. And so, with a bit of extra resource around it, you have those opportunities to learn about what does it take to successfully transplant this technology, and in what areas does that work best? And then you can take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Tom. This has been a really, really exciting and insightful discussion. I am conscious of time, so we need to adjourn the meeting. Mara had to leave early, but I really want to say thank you all for coming together. Our next Indigo peer learning session will be on the 26th of May, and it's going to be about the reflections of our Hack and Learn that is happening in March. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a very nice day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Yes, bye.